Mrs. Collins, why did you transfer your inheritance to your sister? That was the question the bank manager asked me, and in that moment I realized something about my own life had gone terribly wrong. My name is Margaret Collins, I'm 68 years old, and until that Tuesday morning I believed my late father had simply left behind a complicated estate that was still being processed. I had come to the First Harbor Bank in downtown Hartford with nothing more than a simple question about the $250,000 my father had set aside for me in his will. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh coffee, the kind of quiet, respectable place where nothing dramatic ever seems to happen. I sat across from the bank manager, a calm man in his 40s named Daniel Brooks, while sunlight filtered through the tall windows and landed across his neatly organized desk. When he looked up from his computer screen, there was a strange expression on his face, part confusion, part concern, and then he asked that question again, slowly this time, as if giving me a chance to correct myself. Mrs. Collins, the records show that you authorized the full transfer of the inheritance funds to your sister, Emily Carter, nearly 2 years ago. For a moment I simply stared at him, certain I had misunderstood. My sister Emily? I hadn't authorized any transfer. In fact, I hadn't seen a single dollar from my father's estate. For the past 2 years I had been living quietly in my small 2-bedroom home on the edge of town, carefully managing my savings after my husband passed away. Life had become simple, maybe even modest. I drove the same 10-year-old sedan, clipped coupons at the grocery store, and turned the thermostat down every winter evening before bed. Not once did it occur to me that the inheritance my father had promised me had already been moved somewhere else. Meanwhile, Emily's life had changed in ways I couldn't quite explain. She had bought a larger house outside Boston, started taking long vacations, and posted cheerful photos from places like Napa Valley and coastal Maine. Whenever I asked how her business was doing, she would just smile and say things were finally going her way. I believed her. After all, Emily was my younger sister. We had grown up in the same small Connecticut home, shared the same childhood Christmas mornings, and stood side by side at our father's funeral just 2 years earlier. The day we buried him, Emily handled most of the paperwork. She said it would be easier that way while I focused on grieving. At the time, that felt like kindness. Sitting across from Mr. Brooks in that quiet bank office, however, a strange memory surfaced, Emily asking me to sign a few documents shortly after the funeral, telling me they were simply routine forms related to our father's accounts. I had trusted her completely. Daniel Brooks turned his monitor slightly so I could see the screen. There, in plain black numbers, was the transaction record, $250,000 transferred from the estate account directly into an account belonging to Emily Carter. My chest tightened as the realization slowly began to form. Mr. Brooks, I said carefully, my voice quieter than I expected, I never authorized that transfer. The bank manager leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together with a thoughtful look. For a moment he said nothing at all. Then he asked the question that would change everything. Mrs. Collins, are you certain that signature on the authorization form is yours? For several seconds I could not answer the bank manager. I kept staring at the screen in front of me, at the neat rows of numbers that suddenly felt unreal, as if they belonged to someone else's life. $250,000 was not just a number to me. It was the last thing my father had promised before he passed away, something he said would make sure I would never struggle after losing my husband. I finally shook my head slowly and said that I had never signed anything authorizing that transfer. Daniel Brooks did not interrupt me. He simply listened, his expression calm but serious, the way someone listens when they realize a conversation has become far more important than it first appeared. He reached into a folder beside his keyboard and pulled out a printed document, sliding it across the desk so I could see it. The paper was an authorization form from the estate account, dated 3 days after my father's funeral. At the bottom was a signature that looked almost like mine, the same looping M and the long tail at the end of Collins. But the moment I saw it, something inside me felt wrong. It was close, but not quite right. My real signature always slanted slightly upward at the end. This one did not. I looked up at Mr. Brooks and repeated that I had never approved such a transfer. He nodded slowly and asked if I remembered signing any banking paperwork around that time. His question stirred a memory I had not thought about in 2 years. A quiet afternoon at my sister Emily's house just days after the funeral. I had still been exhausted from the long week of visitors, memorial services, and the heavy silence that follows when a parent is suddenly gone. Emily had set a stack of documents on her kitchen table and told me there were a few routine forms connected to our father's accounts. She said the bank needed both daughters to sign so everything could be processed smoothly. I remember barely glancing at the pages. I trusted her completely. She was my younger sister, the one who had always organized family holidays and handled practical details when things became complicated. I signed where she pointed and thanked her for taking care of everything. Sitting in that office now, the memory felt very different. Daniel Brooks watched my reaction carefully. He explained that according to the bank records, the authorization allowed the entire inheritance to be transferred into Emily Carter's personal account. The transaction had been completed the same week those documents were signed. For 2 full years the funds had remained there. I felt a quiet heaviness settle in my chest, not anger yet, but a slow, unsettling realization. During those same 2 years I had been carefully budgeting every expense, postponing home repairs, and telling friends that the inheritance had probably been delayed in legal processing. Meanwhile, Emily had been renovating her house and traveling across the country. I had never connected those changes to anything suspicious. I simply believed my sister had finally found financial success. Daniel Brooks folded his hands again and spoke in a calm, professional voice. He said situations like this were rare, but when a customer questioned a signed authorization, the bank was required to review the documentation carefully. He asked if I would be willing to let the bank's fraud department examine the paperwork. I took another look at the signature on the form, and for the first time a quiet, painful thought entered my mind. If that signature was not mine, then someone very close to me must have known exactly how to copy it. I looked again at the authorization form resting on the polished desk between us, and the more I studied the signature, the more unsettled I felt. It looked familiar at first glance, the same flowing letters I had used for years when signing birthday cards, checks, and legal documents, yet there was something slightly mechanical about it, as if someone had carefully copied the shape without truly understanding the rhythm of how I wrote my own name. Daniel Brooks remained quiet, giving me the space to examine the document without pressure. The office around us was still calm and orderly, the distant murmur of bank customers drifting faintly through the closed door, but inside my mind the past 2 years were beginning to rearrange themselves in a way that no longer felt comfortable. I told him again that I did remember signing papers at Emily's kitchen table shortly after the funeral, but I had never been told that those documents would move my inheritance into her personal account. Daniel nodded thoughtfully and explained that the authorization form was unusually broad, granting full control over the estate funds to the receiving account listed on the document. He turned the page so I could see the account number beside Emily's name, printed clearly in black ink. For a moment I felt embarrassed that I had not noticed such an important detail when I first signed the paperwork, yet at the same time I reminded myself of the circumstances. My father had passed away only days earlier, and grief has a way of dulling the sharp edges of attention. I had trusted my sister completely. As that thought settled in, another memory surfaced quietly. It was the afternoon I visited Emily's house to sign those documents. I could still picture the sunlight coming through the kitchen window and the stack of papers spread neatly across the table. Emily had spoken quickly that day, explaining that the bank required signatures from both daughters so that the estate could be settled efficiently. She had pointed to each line with the tip of a pen and reassured me that everything was routine. I had not questioned her because she sounded confident, organized, and helpful, just as she always had during family matters. Sitting in the bank office now, I felt a slow realization begin to take shape. Over the past 2 years, Emily's life had changed in ways I had quietly admired but never examined closely. She had purchased a larger home outside Boston with a spacious backyard, something she proudly showed in photographs during our holiday calls. She had taken trips to California wine country and posted cheerful pictures beside the ocean in Maine. Each time I saw those images, I assumed her consulting business must have grown more successful. It never crossed my mind that the sudden comfort in her life could have come from somewhere else. Daniel Brooks cleared his throat gently and said the bank would begin reviewing the documents immediately. He explained that the fraud department would compare the signature on the authorization form with several verified signatures from my previous banking records. If there were irregularities, they would open a formal investigation. His tone remained calm and professional, but I sensed that he already suspected something was wrong. I nodded slowly, trying to absorb the idea that the situation might involve more than a simple misunderstanding. As I prepared to leave the office, Daniel asked one final question that lingered in the quiet room. He asked whether anyone besides my sister could have had access to my signature or personal documents during that time. I thought about it carefully, and the answer came to me with a heavy certainty that made my chest tighten. The only person who had been there, guiding every step of those papers across the kitchen table, was Emily herself. When I stepped out of the bank that afternoon, the autumn air felt cooler than it had when I arrived, though the sun was still shining across the quiet streets of Hartford. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine, staring at the steering wheel while my thoughts slowly circled around the same troubling question. Had Emily really taken the inheritance that our father meant for me? For most of my life I had believed that my sister and I shared the same understanding of family loyalty. We were raised in a modest home where our father often reminded us that honesty mattered more than success. He worked nearly 30 years as a mechanical supervisor at a manufacturing plant, waking before sunrise and coming home with the faint smell of machine oil still clinging to his jacket. When he spoke about the inheritance during his final months, he said he wanted both of his daughters to feel secure after he was gone. I remember sitting beside his hospital bed while he explained that the savings account he built over decades would be divided evenly between us. He even smiled gently and told me that the money was meant to make life easier, not to create tension between family members. At the time, Emily nodded beside me and assured him she would take care of the paperwork when the time came. As I drove home through the quiet suburban streets that afternoon, another detail from the past 2 years began to feel different in my memory. Emily had always been organized, but after our father's funeral she had taken an unusually firm role in handling everything related to the estate. She spoke with the attorney, contacted the bank, and reassured me that the process could take months because of legal formalities. I remember thanking her more than once for managing the complicated details while I focused on adjusting to life alone after losing my husband and my father within the same year. For a long time I believed her explanations without hesitation. Yet small moments now returned to my mind with new clarity. The way Emily had rushed through the documents at the kitchen table, pointing quickly to the lines where she wanted me to sign. The way she had folded the papers immediately afterward and placed them in a large envelope before I had a chance to read the pages carefully. At the time I thought she was simply being efficient. Now the memory left me with a quiet discomfort that settled deeper the longer I thought about it. When I finally reached my driveway, I sat there again in silence, looking at the familiar front porch of my small house. For 2 years I had been living carefully, stretching my savings and telling myself that the inheritance would eventually appear once the legal work was finished. I had never asked Emily directly about the timeline because I trusted that she was handling everything honestly. That trust now felt fragile, like a thin sheet of glass that had suddenly developed a crack across its surface. Inside the bank office, Daniel Brooks had promised that the documents would be reviewed by the fraud department, and he had spoken with the calm assurance of someone who believed the truth could be found through careful examination. Yet the real question weighing on my mind had nothing to do with paperwork or signatures. The real question was whether my own sister had quietly built her new life on money that was never meant to be hers. I spent that evening sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, replaying the last 2 years of my life in slow, careful detail. The house was quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock, and for the first time I allowed myself to look at certain memories with a more questioning mind. I remembered the day Emily called me about a month after our father's funeral. Her voice had sounded cheerful, almost relieved, as she explained that the estate paperwork was progressing and that the bank had acknowledged receiving all the required documents. She told me not to worry about the inheritance because those things often took a long time to finalize. At the time I believed her completely. In fact, I thanked her for keeping track of the process because I felt overwhelmed by everything that had happened in such a short period of time. Losing my husband and my father within the same year had left me emotionally drained, and Emily seemed eager to step in and organize the practical details. Over the months that followed, I rarely brought up the subject of the inheritance. Whenever we spoke on the phone, she would quickly change the topic, asking about my garden or telling stories about her new clients. Looking back now, I realized that the conversation always shifted just when financial matters might have come up. At the time I thought she was simply trying to keep our talks pleasant. That night, however, I began remembering something else that once felt harmless but now seemed strangely important. About 6 months after the funeral, Emily invited me to visit her new house outside Boston. It was a beautiful place with tall windows, a large kitchen, and a wide backyard that stretched nearly half an acre behind the property. I remember standing on the deck and complimenting her on how quickly her life seemed to be improving. She laughed lightly and said her consulting business had finally taken off after years of slow growth. I congratulated her without the slightest doubt. After all, people work hard and sometimes their fortunes change. Yet as I sat at my kitchen table that evening, I realized I had never actually seen the business she often talked about. I had never visited an office or met a client. Most of what I knew about it came from brief comments during our phone calls. Another memory followed closely behind that one. During that same visit, she mentioned that dealing with the estate accounts had been more complicated than she expected. She said the bank required several additional forms and that she had taken care of everything so I would not have to worry about the details. I remember thanking her again, feeling grateful that someone in the family was willing to handle those responsibilities. The more I thought about it, the clearer a troubling pattern became. Each explanation had sounded reasonable on its own, yet together they formed a quiet story that I had never examined closely until now. Late that evening my phone rang, and when I looked at the screen I saw the name Daniel Brooks. His voice was calm but more serious than before. He explained that the bank had already begun reviewing the documents connected to the transfer, and the preliminary comparison of signatures raised several concerns. He did not say the word fraud directly, but the meaning was clear enough. When the call ended, I sat there for a long moment staring at the dark window above the sink. For the first time since leaving the bank that afternoon, a difficult realization settled fully in my mind. If the investigation confirmed what it seemed to suggest, then the person who had quietly taken my inheritance was not a stranger or a distant acquaintance. It was my own sister, the same person who had promised our father she would take care of everything after he was gone. I did not sleep much that night. The quiet house seemed heavier than usual, as if every room was waiting for an answer I was not yet ready to face. I woke before sunrise and made coffee, standing by the kitchen window while the early light slowly spread across the backyard. For years my mornings had followed the same calm routine, but that day every small detail felt different. The call from Daniel Brooks kept repeating in my mind, especially the careful way he had chosen his words when explaining the concerns about the signature. He had not accused anyone directly, yet the message was clear enough. Something about those documents did not look right. Later that morning I drove to the grocery store, trying to continue my day as normally as possible, but even there my thoughts kept drifting back to Emily. I remembered the countless ordinary conversations we had shared since our father passed away. Birthday calls, holiday greetings, and the occasional lunch when she came through town. Each time she spoke warmly, asking about my health and reminding me to take care of myself. There had never been a moment when her voice sounded nervous or uncertain. If anything, she always sounded relaxed and confident, the way someone speaks when they believe everything around them is exactly as it should be. That realization unsettled me more than anything else. If the inheritance had truly been transferred into her account without my knowledge, then she had been carrying that secret through every one of those conversations. By late afternoon my phone rang again, and when I saw Daniel Brooks's name appear on the screen I felt my stomach tighten slightly. His tone remained calm and professional, but this time there was less hesitation in his voice. He explained that the fraud department had completed an initial comparison between the authorization form and several verified signatures from my previous banking records. According to their analysis, the signature on the transfer document did not match the natural writing patterns found in my verified samples. He said the differences were subtle but consistent enough to raise serious concerns. I asked him quietly what would happen next. He explained that the bank would begin a formal review of the transaction and gather additional documentation connected to the estate account. If the evidence confirmed that the authorization had not been legitimately signed, the bank would be required to escalate the case for further investigation. As he spoke, I sat at my kitchen table listening carefully to every word, trying to keep my voice steady. When the call ended, I remained there for several minutes, looking at the old family photograph hanging on the wall across the room. It showed Emily and me standing beside our father many years ago at a summer picnic, all three of us smiling in the bright afternoon sun. I studied that picture longer than I ever had before, searching the familiar faces for some hint that might explain how our lives had reached this point. I had always believed that trust between siblings was one of the strongest bonds a family could have. Yet now, as the quiet house settled around me again, I understood that the truth about the inheritance was no longer just a question about missing money. It was a question about whether the person I had trusted most within my own family had quietly built her new life on something that was never meant to belong to her. I spent the next 2 days moving through my routine as quietly as possible, but everything felt slightly altered, as if the ground beneath my ordinary life had shifted just enough to make every step uncertain. The bank investigation had begun, and although Daniel Brooks assured me that the process would take time, the simple fact that the documents were now being examined made the situation feel more real with each passing hour. During those days, I found myself noticing details about Emily that I had ignored before. I remembered how rarely she visited my house anymore, preferring instead to suggest that we meet halfway for lunch when she happened to be traveling through Connecticut. I remembered how quickly she changed the subject whenever conversations drifted near our father's estate. At the time those moments felt like small social habits. Now they appeared like carefully placed turns in a conversation meant to avoid a particular road. On the third morning my phone rang again while I was watering the plants on my back porch. When I saw Daniel Brooks's name appear on the screen, I set the watering can down slowly and answered. His voice remained calm, but there was a firmness in his tone that had not been there before. He explained that the fraud department had completed a deeper examination of the authorization form and the supporting documents connected to the estate account. According to their findings, the signature did not match any verified examples from my previous banking records, and several formatting details on the document suggested that it may have been prepared outside the bank's normal process. Daniel paused for a moment before continuing, choosing his words carefully. He said the bank would now begin reviewing the full transaction history connected to the account that received the transfer. That account, of course, belonged to Emily Carter. Hearing her name spoken in that quiet, professional tone made the situation feel unmistakably real. I thanked him for keeping me informed, though my voice sounded distant even to my own ears. After the call ended I remained standing on the porch, looking out across the small yard where my husband had once spent long summer afternoons trimming the hedges and planting roses along the fence. Life had always felt steady there, simple and predictable. Now it felt as though a hidden story had been unfolding just beneath the surface without my ever noticing. Later that afternoon another memory returned to me, one that had seemed unimportant until now. About a year after our father passed away, Emily had mentioned that she was thinking about opening a new investment account to manage some of her savings. She had laughed lightly and said that dealing with financial institutions had become second nature after handling the estate paperwork. At the time I smiled and told her she had always been better with numbers than I was. Standing in my quiet kitchen that evening, however, that conversation carried a different meaning. If the bank investigation confirmed what the early findings suggested, then Emily had not simply helped organize our father's affairs. She had quietly redirected them. The thought settled heavily in my mind as I turned off the kitchen lights and prepared for bed. For the first time since the bank manager asked that simple question days earlier, I realized that the investigation was no longer about whether a mistake had been made. It was about discovering how carefully the truth had been hidden. The next call from Daniel Brooks came 3 days later, just after noon, while I was folding laundry in the quiet comfort of my living room. The calm routine of the morning had almost allowed me to forget the weight of the investigation, but the moment I saw his name appear on my phone, I knew the quiet waiting period was over. His voice sounded steady, though there was a seriousness beneath it that immediately caught my attention. He explained that the fraud department had completed a deeper review of the account activity connected to the estate transfer. The $250,000 had not remained untouched in Emily's account as I had quietly hoped. Instead, the funds had been gradually moved over the course of several months into multiple accounts and financial products. Some had been used toward the purchase of property, while other portions had been transferred into investment accounts registered under Emily's name. Daniel paused before continuing, as though giving me time to absorb what he had just said. I sat down slowly on the couch, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the next room while the details settled in my mind. The money had not simply been sitting there waiting to be returned. It had been actively used to build the life Emily had shown me in photographs and cheerful phone calls. Daniel explained that the bank would now request additional documentation directly from Emily regarding the authorization and the movement of the funds. In situations like this, he said, the bank's responsibility was to determine whether the transaction had been legitimately approved or whether the documents had been created under false circumstances. I thanked him again for keeping me informed, though my voice sounded strangely calm even to myself. After we ended the call, I remained sitting there for a long time, staring across the room at the bookshelf where old family albums were stored. Eventually I stood up and pulled one of the albums from the shelf. The photographs inside showed decades of small family moments, summer barbecues, holiday dinners, birthdays celebrated around a crowded table. Emily appeared in many of those pictures, smiling beside me, standing with our father, laughing with relatives whose faces I had not seen in years. As I turned the pages slowly, I realized that the person in those photographs felt increasingly distant from the version of my sister that the bank investigation was beginning to reveal. That evening, as the sun lowered behind the trees outside my kitchen window, I thought again about the promise our father had made during his final weeks. He had spoken so carefully about fairness between his daughters, explaining that the savings he had built over a lifetime was meant to help both of us feel secure in the years ahead. At the time I believed that promise would remain untouched by anything as ordinary as paperwork or banking procedures. Now it seemed that the real challenge was not the documents themselves but the quiet choices that had been made behind them. Somewhere between the day we stood beside our father's hospital bed and the afternoon I signed those papers at Emily's kitchen table, a decision had been made that changed everything. And as the bank continued its investigation, it was becoming clearer that the truth behind that decision would not remain hidden much longer. The following morning arrived quietly, with the soft gray light of early autumn drifting through the kitchen window while I prepared my coffee. For the first time since the investigation began, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over the house. It was not the calm of comfort, but the calm that comes when uncertainty slowly gives way to clarity. Later that day Daniel Brooks called again, and his tone carried the careful certainty of someone who had finally reached the end of a complicated process. He explained that the bank had completed its full review of the authorization form, the transaction history, and the documentation connected to the estate account. Their conclusion was clear. The authorization used to transfer the inheritance had not been legitimately approved by me, and the signature on the document was determined to be inconsistent with every verified sample on file. Because of those findings, the bank had formally classified the transfer as unauthorized. Daniel also explained that their legal department had already begun the process of notifying Emily Carter and requesting documentation that could justify the movement of the funds. If no valid authorization could be produced, the case would move forward through formal recovery procedures. I listened quietly, absorbing each word as it settled into place like pieces of a long unfinished puzzle. When the call ended, I placed the phone gently on the table and looked around the small kitchen that had become my entire world over the past few years. For a long time I had believed that the inheritance my father left behind was simply delayed somewhere within a complicated legal system. Now the truth had finally stepped into the open. The money had never been delayed. It had been taken. That afternoon I did something I had been quietly avoiding since the investigation began. I called Emily. The phone rang several times before she answered, and when she spoke her voice sounded cheerful, just as it always had during our ordinary conversations. For a moment I almost responded in the same familiar tone, but instead I told her calmly that the bank had completed its review of the estate transfer. There was a short silence on the line, the kind that feels longer than it really is. I explained that the bank had determined the authorization form was not legitimate and that they would now be requesting documentation from her directly. Emily did not interrupt me while I spoke. When I finished, the silence returned, heavier this time. Finally she said that there must be some misunderstanding and that she would look into the matter. Her voice sounded different now, careful and measured in a way I had never heard before. I told her there was no need for explanations between us at that moment because the bank would handle the process from here. After that, there was nothing left to say. When the call ended, I stood by the kitchen window again and watched the quiet neighborhood outside. For the first time since Daniel Brooks asked that simple question days earlier, I understood something clearly. The inheritance my father left behind was never meant to divide his daughters. It was meant to give us stability and peace. Yet the real lesson he left me was not hidden inside a bank account or a legal document. It was the quiet understanding that truth has a way of resurfacing, no matter how carefully someone tries to bury it beneath signatures, paperwork, and time.